thank you very, very much. Let me begin with a story from the forests of Borneo. It was close to dusk with, could we have the first image up, please? It was close to dusk with thunder over the valley and the forest alive with the roar of black cicadas. And I was sitting by the forest with my friend Asik Niilik, the headman of the Ubang River Penang, the last nomadic people of Southeast Asia. And the moon shone through the canopy, and Asik looked up to the heavens, and he looked to me, and he looked to the moon, and he said, "Is it true that your people have really been there? And if that's true, how did they go? What kind of transport did they have? How long did it take? And is it true that they really just brought back rock and dust?" Well, it was difficult to explain to a man who kindled fire with flint and whose entire possessions could be carried on his back a space program that had consumed the wealth of nations and catapulted 12 men collectively 1.5 billion miles through space, or the fact that they did indeed only come back with rock and dust, 828 pounds of it altogether. But of course, the Sikh's question provoked the timeless answer. The true purpose of those journeys was not to acquire wealth, but to realize a new vision of life itself. And the seminal moment, as some of us can remember, came on Christmas Eve, 1968, when Apollo went around the dark side of the moon and emerged for the first time in human history, not to see a moonrise or a sunrise, but the Earth itself ascendant. And that image, more than any amount of scientific data, taught us finally that the Earth was this finite place that could endure our ways for only so long. And almost immediately we began, it's extraordinary, to think in new ways. Just imagine 40 years ago, just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was a great environmental victory. No one spoke of the biosphere or biodiversity. Now those terms are part of the vernacular of school children. And like this great wave of hope, this energy of illumination made possible by the space program spread everywhere. Just think about it. In 30 years, women have gone from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar. What's not to love about such a world capable of such transformations? And it seems to me that since that time, the world has sort of become divided between those who sort of opened that door of disruption and saw the future as it was to be, but then got frightened and slammed the door shut and went along with life as they always had, from those of us who recognize that message from space as being what it was, a message of truly biblical proportions. And for those in that latter category, sustainability is not simply a slogan, it's the only conceivable path forward. It doesn't represent a transition, it represents a profound transformation, which will not be easy because it runs against our most deep, profound trait as our species, the fluidity of our memory and our capacity to forget. I mean, how many of us remember that in the time of my own great-grandfather, buffalo outnumbered people in North America? In the time of my grandfather, passenger pigeons were 40% of the birds in North America. Single flocks of 2 and 3 billion birds would eclipse the sun over the cities of the American Midwest. How many can remember that in the time of my own father, the return of the salmons colored the oceans in the Gulf of Alaska? People are able to adapt to any degree of environmental degradation, and that is a haunting fact. But let me share with you an even more positive revelation, and this comes from the realm of genetics. Within the last generation, geneticists have finally proven it to be true, something that philosophers always hoped to be true, and that's we're all brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean quite literally, studies of the human genome have left no doubt whatsoever that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Race is an utter fiction. We're all cut from the same genetic cloth. We're all descendants of the same handful of people who walked out of Africa 65,000 years ago, and then over 2,500 human generations settled the habitable world. But here's the important thing. If we're cut from the same genetic cloth, we share the same genius. And how that genius is expressed is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no evolutionary social Darwinian progress in the affairs of culture. That old 19th century idea that we went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized Strand of London has been utterly debunked by modern science and shown to be an artifact of the 19th century, as relevant to our lives today as a notion that clergymen had then, that the earth was but 6,000 years old. And what this means is that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being us. They're not failed attempts at being modern. Each culture is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 voices of humanity, which become our collective repertoire. And what this means is very simple. Every culture has something to say, and each deserves to be heard. No one culture embodies humanity's total potential. Modernity is simply an expression of cultural values that represent one way of organizing human activities. It's not some inexorable force of nature existing outside of history and culture. It's a product of both. And modernity's greatest attribute is technological wizardry. Its capacity to erode the biosphere is its most profound and disturbing consequence. Now, during the Enlightenment, in our effort to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of absolute faith, the tyranny of a medieval church, we liberated the individual from the collective, which was a sociological equivalent of splitting the atom. And in doing so, we abandoned all intuitions for myth, magic, and mysticism, and most especially metaphor that had given meaning to our lives. As Descartes famously said, the universe was composed only of mind and mechanism. And so with a single phrase, he deanimated all sentient creatures aside from ourselves. As Saul Bellow said, science made a house cleaning of belief. Phenomena that could not be measured could not exist. The triumph of secular materialism became the conceit of modernity. The idea that a bird could have anima, that the flight of a hawk could have meaning, was ridiculed, dismissed as ridiculous. And that's the worldview that created this relationship to the earth as if the earth was simply a commodity waiting to be exploited. That's how I was raised. I was raised in the forests of British Columbia to believe that those forests existed to be cut. That was the ideology of scientific forestry. That made me very different than my brother amongst the Kwakwaka'wak, raised to believe that those same forests were the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven and the cannibal spirits that dwelt at the north end of the world, spirits that would have to be embraced during the Hamet's initiation, such as the wisdom of the wild would come back to the community in the potlatch. Now, the issue isn't who's right and who's wrong. Is the forest cellulose and board feet? Is it the domain of the spirits? The interesting thing is how the belief system metaphorically creates a unique relationship between the human society and the resource, often with profoundly different consequences in terms of the ecological footprint. The full measure of a culture embraces not only its actions as a people, but its aspirations and the nature of the metaphors that carry it forward. And this, I think, can begin to give you a sense of how Indigenous people in general relate to the natural world. Not through nostalgia, not through sentiment. There's not a lot of room for either emotion in the malarial swamps of New Guinea, in the harsh mountain reaches of Tibet, or indeed in the Syrian sands of the Sahara. Indigenous people are neither weakened by nostalgia or convulsed by sentiment, but they have nevertheless forged a traditional mystique of the earth, not based on nostalgia. Nostalgia is most assuredly not a trait associated with the hunters of the northern ice. Their relation is based on a much more subtle intuition, and that is the idea that the earth itself only exists because it is breathed into being by the human imagination. And what these cultures have done, in some sense, is create an animate world where mountains, rivers, and forests are perceived not as being inert, mere props on the human stage, but rather as fundamental elements, dynamic forces with which the human society must engage. And so if we go into the forest of the Amazon, the homeland of the Barasana, who came up the Milk River from the east in the belly of the sacred serpent being regurgitated on the banks of the northwest Amazon, a people who cognitively do not distinguish the color blue from the color green because the canopy of the heaven is equated to the canopy of the rainforest, a people who literally believe that they can journey through space to become the ancestors and re-inhabit the time of Earth at its beginning, a people who literally have mythologies that we now understand are nothing more or less than complex land management plans dictating exactly how you can live sustainably in the upland forests of the Amazon. Or heading up into the Andes itself, a place where everything is driven by reciprocal relationships between an abundant earth, Pachamama, and the obligations of people to that earth. You know, when the Spanish arrived, the first thing they tried to do is destroy every sacred shrine of the Inca. But what they failed to understand is that it wasn't the shrine that was important, it was the land upon which the shrine stood. And so in destroying the temple, the Spanish only reaffirmed the inherent sanctity of the particular site. And of course, in the Andes, all of this is expressed through ritual. My godson, fastest young boy in his community, becomes a woman for a day, and leading the banners of the community runs a race, but it's not your ordinary race. You begin at 11,500 feet, fall 3,000 feet, race running to 16,000 feet, and cross 2 more soaring Andean ridges. The metaphor is through sacrifice, you make sacred the land. The human becomes part of a community. The community reaffirms its place on the planet. I did this race at 48, my midlife crisis. I was the oldest man ever to do it, the only outsider ever to do it. And I only got through the 24 hours by chewing more coca leaves than anyone had chewed in 4,000 years. But these localized rituals become pan-Andean, like this incredible event where tens of thousands of native people go into the mountains, carrying their crosses in the shadow of the sacred Mount Ausangati, planting them in the ice to be empowered by Pachamama and carried back. Or in the homeland of the Elder Brothers, in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in Colombia, the Arahuacos and Kogi, who literally believe that their prayers maintain the ecological balance of the world. In a blood-stained continent still ruled by a ritual priesthood, the training for the priesthood involves 18 years in the shadowy darkness as they're enculturated in the values of their society, which maintains this conviction that their mythology, their beliefs, their cosmology, their rituals maintain the harmony of the universe. And after 18 years, the initiate, who has never seen the sunrise, is suddenly taken out on a journey to the heart of the world. And the priest who has trained him says, you see, it's as I've told you. It's yours to protect. And here they are, 2 hours from Miami Beach, praying every day for our collective well-being. We come here to Australia. When the British first met the Aboriginal people, they looked strange to them. They had a simple technology. But what offended the British was that the Aboriginal people had no interest in improving upon their lot. So in the inimitable way, the British concluded that the Aboriginal people were not human at all, and they began to shoot them. In 1902, in this city, it was debated in Parliament as to whether or not Aboriginal people were human or not. In the 1950s in Australia, there were quotas for ranchers who could shoot Aboriginal people with impunity on their lands. And if we move from what was really going on in Australia, of course, was a devotional philosophy far too subtle for the British to appreciate. That was the dreaming. And the dreaming wasn't a dream, it was a state of perpetual existence where past, present, and future fused into one, and not one of the 670 languages and dialects of this continent was there a word for past, future, or present, or for time. There was only the dreaming. And the whole purpose of life was not to improve upon anything, but rather to do the ritual gestures deemed to be necessary to keep the world exactly as it was at the time of its creation, the rainbow serpent. It would be like if all of intellectual thought in Europe had gone into pruning the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keep it just as it was when Adam and Eve had that fateful conversation. But again, the issue isn't to say who's right and who's wrong. Had we followed this devotional trajectory, we would not have put a man on the moon. But on the other hand, we wouldn't have Tim on stage today warning us as to the consequences of climate change. So why, if we go into the Arctic, where the impact of climate change is so powerfully being felt? Now remember, we think of climate change as a political debate, a technical problem. But if you believe that you're responsible for the well-being of the Earth, if it's in trouble, it's your fault. So climate change throughout the world is a profoundly spiritual and psychological trauma for the indigenous peoples of the world. In the language of the polar Eskimo, sila means both weather and consciousness, and the weather is changing beneath them. In Kanak, where that photograph was taken, the ice used to come in September and stay till July. Now it comes in November and is gone by March. Their entire world has literally melted from beneath them. I was once with an elder on a headland in a rainstorm in March, and he simply said, "This is not our weather. Where does it come from?" So the question really becomes, why should the voices of these indigenous peoples be listened to? Why should we hear them? Well, there are many answers to that question, but I would say it comes down to two words: climate change. Not because anyone is suggesting that we go back to a pre-industrial past or that any of these societies be kept from the genius of modernity, but simply because their existence reminds us that our world is not the only world, and the choices we've made are not indelibly engraved in our destiny. You know, we have, for 3 centuries, consumed the ancient sunlight of the world. Our economic models are projections when they should be circles. To define economic well-being as perpetual growth on a finite planet is to commit a slow act of collective suicide. To deny or exclude from the calculus of governance and economy the ecological costs of compromising the biological life support systems of the planet is the economics of delusion. These voices matter because they still exist to tell us that there are indeed other alternatives, other ways of orienting people in social, spiritual, ecological space. And it's to draw inspiration from the fact that the path we have taken is not the only one available. And their very existence puts a lie to those among us who say that we cannot change, as we know we all must change the fundamental way in which we inhabit the planet. We really do need, as Father Barry so beautifully wrote, an utterly new dream of the earth, based not on nostalgia going backwards, but using the brilliance of technological wizardry to construct a way forward in which our economy will be based on circles and in which every child will have a chance to continue to live in this kind of naked geography of hope, which is the human destiny. Thanks very much.